I think it's fair to say that part of the reason the East lasted as long as it did is the topic that we've mentioned, which is the structure of government. So can we just zoom out once again and explain the key ways that government functioned in the East Roman Empire and how it evolved over the lifetime of the empire?
Very broadly speaking, there's civilian and military, right? And you might actually add the church. It's entirely plausible to treat the church as a kind of government institution at this time. But let's just stick with military and civilian. The military is pretty straightforward, would be recognizable to any student of military history. This is how you recruit, organize, equip, pay, and lead soldiers. And the East Roman state tends to have a larger military, at least paper strength. Active is a different matter. Like how many soldiers you take on a campaign is a different matter, but how many soldiers you maintain, like in the provinces generally, right, it tends to be on the large side for medieval society, right? So it compares favorably to, say, the Caliphate later on, which is a much more massive territorial entity. So the military is that it can have anywhere between 100,000 at a minimum at a low point up to maybe about 250,000 at a high point, depending on the period. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of men. Factor in their families, right? These are also like part of the whole, military economic complex, if you will.
And they're career military, so like this is their job. And,
yes.
And is the military for most of the history of the East Roman Empire defensive military?
Mostly, but not always.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Justinian.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so then you have the civilian administration. Civilian administration does a number of things. Principally, it is to find the funds to pay for this army, which is the single largest expense on the state budget, right? And so in order to find those funds, it has to have census of the assets, and it has to be able to tax them. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. So the civilian administration has a number of tax bureaus, records keeping, this sort of thing. Also a legal branch for resolving disputes with the imperial fisc. Okay. But the civilian administration does a number of other things too. For example, the whole legal regulation of the empire, the courts, judges, courts of appeal, or also issuing laws, keeping records, all of this. And those are the main bureaus that have to do with the subjects of the empire.
Mm-hmm.
The emperors obviously maintain bureaus that are for things like diplomacy, right, or running the palace staff, because the palace is a huge institution, right? And then there are a number of endowments that, major churches, Hagia Sophia, for example, has hundreds of staff, clergy to, readers to whatever. And so they need to be paid. And so you need endowments. The imperial household, it has expenses, so it needs endowments, right? So there's a lot of land that's earmarked for these kinds of expenses that requires administration. So this multiplies, right? I mean, go on and on and on and on.
And I'm sure the tax code is not a simple flat tax. It's probably incredibly complicated. So it's just like in the United States. It feels like majority of the United States is basically lawyers and the IRS. That's 98%, I think, is lawyers. I'm not sure. It's scientifically.
I thought they shrunk the IRS down now to a size that it can't actually do anything.
They shrunk it down
I thought
to just 90%.
Just 90%.
No. I think there is something. This is another conversation about human nature and about the nature of governments. But there's something about, I think it's impossible to have an IRS type organization that doesn't grow. I think maybe with good intentions, because you have to everybody always comes to you. Well, here's my special case. I want my tax to be lower. And they kind of add another line. All right, if you have purple hair, the tax decrease. And so you keep adding. And then, of course, the more you add, the more opaque the thing becomes, therefore corruption seeps in, or maybe not like official corruption, but
Yeah.
corruption light. And then that tax code grows, and then all of a sudden you have these big institutions that then
Yes.
encourage corruption, and then there's a bureaucracy and there's a momentum, and this is just how humans are.
Yes. So this happens in East Roman society too. I'll give you some examples. So there's not a tax code as such, but the way it operates is through basically exemptions. So you petition for an exemption. You might be a monastery, you might be a wealthy land, you might be someone well connected to the court, you might be a struggling provincial village, and you petition the emperor or some official, and you say, "Hey, we had bad season, or the barbarians came through and they took all of our. We can't pay the taxes. Could we have an exemption?" And emperors often are granting these exemptions for very specific things, like maybe for this year or for that tax or whatever. The problem is that the emperors are discovering every once in a while that their officials are granting these exemptions sort of on their own. So every once in a while, the emperors have to clear house, and they have to like cancel all of these exemptions and start the whole process again. But later on, once we start to have documentation, like maybe in the 11th century, we see that every little, well, not every, but we have all these monasteries, these little villages, these high officials, and they all have these documents that give them exemption from this or that or the other thing. And it gets so complicated, and that's how it works.
But it is the engine of society that makes the whole thing work, because you have to fund. There's infrastructure projects, but you have to fund the army, and the army is necessary to defend against all the military incursions.
Yeah.
A good fraction of the bureaucracy seem to have been eunuchs, which are castrated men. Can you explain why this was a prominent thing?
The eunuchs are part of the household staff of the emperor. So that would be like, what would it be? The West Wing of the White House or something like this.
Yeah.
So they are the people who handle the imperial person, the bedchamber, the organization of palace life, things like banquets, these kinds of things, the wardrobe. And why are they important? So for starters, if you're physically with the emperor all day, right? Like you're handling the meetings, right? People can come to you and say, "Hey, I need you to put in a good word for whatever," right? So they can get things done. So you bribe them, they get things done. So they're very useful in this way. They're also kind of hated for that reason, right? But they're also kind of there to be hated. In other words, they soak up a lot of the frustration that people sometimes feel when they're not getting, what they want from the court. Okay, that's one thing. Here's the other thing that's more interesting. How do you as an emperor make sure that your bureaucracy doesn't displace you? Like if the bureaucracy is handling all the matters of running the empire, what do we need you for? Right? Like the bureaucracy can develop rules of its own for solving all the problems, for dealing with petitions and exemptions and whatever. Like they can do it. So where's your power exactly? So what the emperors did not want is to be displaced or overshadowed by these kinds of more impersonal institutions. And so they would often set up parallel tracks of power. So this could be a bit confusing. So eunuchs were perfect for this reason because often their origin was from outside the empire, or they were former slaves. They weren't connected to networks of powerful families. So you knew that they would generally be loyal to you because they depended entirely on you, the emperor, for their position and their power. And what you would sometimes do is you'd say, "Okay, I'm putting you in charge of this army," literally, putting you in charge of an army, just so that you can counterbalance the kind of networks of established generals, and you'll have a eunuch from my wardrobe. I'm putting him in charge. And so this kind of shook things up a little bit, so that people who were part of a system or a network could never fully count that could get them all the power that they wanted. Now they have to answer to this eunuch from the wardrobe who's outside of their system. And sometimes these eunuchs were extremely competent, like Narcisse, Justinian's general, who defeated the Goths in Italy in this massive battle. This guy was a total hard ass. And he was this little old man. He was very old. He was tiny, and he was a eunuch. And the Goths laughed at him, but he had the last laugh, right?
Is there some component to them being eunuchs so they can't propagate the bloodline?
Yeah, they can't have their own family, so they can't be like looking out for their own offspring. They're kind of isolated individuals who depend entirely on your favor.
Is it known whether the castration is almost always by force?
There are eunuchs in society generally. They're often bishops. They're appointed Patriarch of Constantinople sometimes. They're in all kinds of positions. Many of them are children who are enslaved and castrated against their will. Sometimes, however, they are castrated very much according to the will of their families. In some parts of, like in Caucasia, there were some regions that were famous for producing eunuchs, also in Persia and so forth. But also, we are pretty sure that this happened within the empire because there were some families that like really wanted to place a eunuch at the court.
Right.
So from Paphlagonia, there were a number of, this is in northern Asia Minor. And so they would, it was almost like a family strategy.
I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating that they had so much representation in the inner circles of the emperor, and therefore had real influence.
Oh, yeah. But this was the case always, even in Rome, like in the Julio-Claudians under, the first Caesars. There are all these powerful eunuchs, and the senatorial class always hates them. I mean, it's the same dynamic.
One of the interesting things you said, as an aside in one of the many podcasts I listened with you, is you said that there were no isolated people. People that are disconnected from the empire. Maybe who, for example, don't know about the taxes or just don't feel integrated into the system. I mean, that's really interesting to me, that there's so much connectivity, there's so much cohesion as an entire peoples.
These people do not exist, these isolated peasants. This is a myth that one day I'm going to write a chapter about this, because it's this idea that you occasionally encounter, well, actually quite often in the scholarship, that there are these sort of rural communities out there somewhere that don't know what's going on in Constantinople. They might not even know who the emperor is. They're cut off. Maybe a tax official will show up every once in a while, maybe not. And they just live their lives on their own, unaffected by the, say, state, because the medieval state, we suspect, is, always powerless and can't, affect people's lives. There's no proof for these communities at all. At most, you might try to find some like actual hermits, like actual Christian ascetic hermits who try to go out and find this situation. And sometimes they're described in the text as like, oh, so-and-so went so far out into the mountains that like not even the tax census people showed up there, which tells you how they think about what it means to be isolated, right? So this is a state in which every arable, piece of arable land has been censused for centuries. It's not like you can hide a village, right? And the taxation process is not like they visit once a year, give us some coin, and we'll leave. It's actually more like 3 times a year. And the taxes is not just coin and maybe a payment in kind or something, but it's a whole bunch of things like services and recruits and all. You're right. And once you start adding all of these things up, it creates a very dense institutional matrix in which all communities are enmeshed. They can't get out of it. Also, they have a church, don't they? And if they have a church, they have the calendar. And of course they have the calendar like, how do they organize time and space and boundaries and all of these things? No, this is all state institutions. How do they pay for anything? They have coins. Coins are everywhere. So I think that these institutions structured the way that everyone, even in village communities, even in the most isolated ones, supposedly, how they thought about things like time and space and value and relations and power and kinship and so forth.
So what you're saying is taxation is the thing that brings the empire together.
It is, principally, yes.
I mean, it's true, right? This is how you know.
Yeah. But on top of that is layered things like the economy, coins, right? But also there's a church.
Yeah, and the church is important, just like you said. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's churches throughout the empire.
Yes, and they have sermons and they pray for the emperor after this service. No, there are no isolated communities.
So one of the things I briefly mentioned, just it would be nice to elaborate on, is this term of monarchic republic. So we've been throwing around words like kingdom and republic and empire and monarchy. So what's a good applicable term to what this thing is,
Yes.
the East Roman Empire?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad you flagged that, because we call it conventionally Byzantine Empire, and it's neither of those things really. We've talked about Byzantine.
Yeah.
Now, empire is a bit of a problem because, first of all, there's no term in Greek, in the Greek that they use at this period, that corresponds to our notion of empire. It's not part of the official terms. It's not even, they didn't even have a term for it. There's some terms that might mean something like state, archi maybe, or kratos. But for the most part, it's either vasilia, which we might translate as monarchy, or politia, which is polity. And politia in Greek, polity, is a Greek translation of Latin res publica.
Mm-hmm.
Res publica doesn't mean republic the way we mean it for the Romans, like a non-monarchical regime, right? That's how we mean like the American Republic, or, that's a usage that came in later, like during the Enlightenment. In Latin, a res publica is the common affairs, the common interest of a people who are constituted as a political community, regardless of the type of regime that they have. Like even Cicero could imagine the Roman res publica governed by a king or by a senate or by a democracy. And they continue to use that term. We don't use it according to Roman norms. We use it according to modern norms, the term republic. So they continue to call it a res publica or a polity under the emperors as well, right? And it was understood that the role of the emperor, whether he's Caesar or Vasilevs or in whatever language, was to serve the polity. They keep saying this. So the terms that occur in the sources most commonly are Vasilia of the Romans, polity of the Romans, or Romania, which is the proper name of this state, not empire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, empire. Empire in modern English, commonly, an empire is a state that's created when one group conquers a bunch of others and rules them. It could be an ethnic group, it could be an ethno-religious group, it could be a political group, whatever, but there's an act of conquest and results in a state where one group is ruling over others. That's not how Romania is actually constituted. We've talked about this. It's, for the most part, all Roman citizens ruling themselves, like Roman subjects ruling themselves through their own government. So it's not an empire, strictly speaking. Now, occasionally, they will conquer other people. Like we talked about the warfare. Sometimes it's not just defensive, sometimes it's offensive, right? In that case, you do establish an imperial relationship. Like we, the Romans, are ruling over this other group. Could be Slavs, it could be Bulgarians for a while, it could be whatever. Or even some Muslims in northern Syria for a while in the 11th century. And you are not Romans. And that's an imperial relationship. The question is, how many of these imperial relationships do you need to decide that, well, we've reached a tipping point and now we're just going to call the whole thing an empire? Mm-hmm. Personally, I don't think we ever reach that point. I mean, all states, even today, have like minorities. Some of them are part of that state because they were conquered once upon a time. But we don't call those states empires necessarily. Even though, like, look at the United Kingdom. Well, Wales was conquered. And, the Welsh have their own identity, their own language. I don't know that you would call that now an imperial relationship. Maybe. I don't know.
I think there's also a synonymous use of the word empire that refers to the power that the state has in the global context geopolitically. So sometimes empire is used synonymously with superpower, meaning it's one of the primary nations in the world, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the imperial nature of its history.
That's true.
Hence the sort of American empire, U.S. empire.
Yes, though you would never characterize the American political regime as an imperial one, insofar as it does not have an emperor, for example. But anyway, yes, the problem is that in my field, we use the term empire conventionally, even when what you just described is clearly not happening, like even toward the end. It's not a major world power. It has a few islands in the Peloponnese, but we call it empire and the emperor, and it's completely ridiculous. There's not even a term in their language for that sort of thing. Anyway, we can call things whatever we want, just so we understand what the reality is and what we are using those terms to mean. I think that's the important thing. Yeah.
So then let's look at words which are both fascinating. Monarchic republic.
Right.
Why is that a good term for the East Roman Empire?
Because they understood it very much to be a polity in the Roman sense of a res publica that was governed by a regime that was monarchical.
So those two elements, there's a emperor dude at the top, and it's functioned politically like a republic.
Also, the emperor was expected to be working for the republic. They keep saying this. So this was their conception. You don't find it, for example, in other kinds of dynastic empires, the ones that don't emerge from within the context of an ancient republic. So this is another reason why I find this civilization so fascinating. I mean, we mentioned the Greek and the Roman and the Christian elements that are kind of jostling together. This is fascinating to me in part because it's this weird combination of monarchical power, like in terms of executive institutions, and a republican kind of baseline ideology on which it operates. Yeah, and they sometimes come to a head.
Is there at all a degree to which it's a military dictatorship? Because especially when it's a general in the emperor's seat, yes, there's a republic, yes, there's political discussion, but the army has a lot of power. So to what degree is it a military dictatorship, as is sometimes talked about when you talk about the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so Augustus's position, for example, and that of his successors is talked about as a military dictatorship. In other words, when push comes to shove and the basis of political power is the army, then I suppose it's legitimate for historians to talk about a military dictatorship. But here's why I don't think the Eastern Roman Empire is a military dictatorship, even though, again, the emperors control the armies, and the armies themselves will often have a say in who becomes emperor, like through the civil wars that we mentioned. Okay. The reason why I don't think it's a military dictatorship is because they almost never, very, very, very rarely, use the army as an instrument of social control.
Isn't that strange to you? Because you see that being done through so much of human history.
Yeah.
And the fact they don't resort to that. I mean, for 1,000 years, that's just not a thing.
As a way of keeping down the population, you just don't see it. And part of the reason for that is I don't think the population needs to be kept down. This gets back to the consensus that we were talking about. The understanding is that the army is there to protect the Roman people and is often recruited among them. And for most of the period that I study lives among them. So when the emperors have to call up the army, they're literally calling up soldiers from local villages.
It's just incredible that this worked. I guess the Civil War thing is, as a mechanism, is effective. Because you just, throughout human history, I mean, you look at even recent history, it's just a very common thing for an authoritarian figure to use the army to suppress people.
Yeah, but isn't that dangerous, though? Look at how many modern regimes tried to use their own armies against their people who were in a moment of rising up. Well, it's a risk, like the Arab Spring, especially in Egypt. And you could tell for those 3 weeks that Mubarak was trying to decide whether he could actually count on the army to suppress the protesters or not. Because you never know what they're going to do if you ask them to fire on a civilian population. It can backfire on you badly. So I think that is a very dangerous force to use, and even in the context of modern regimes, can result in a regime change.
No, absolutely, and there's huge wisdom behind that, but, leaders are not always wise, often not wise,
Yeah.
and often maybe they start out wise, but power corrupts them over time, and so the fact that this does not happen just over and over and over and over on the
No.
East Roman Empire is there's just signal there that's fascinating, and, I mean, this goes to the book that you want to be working on,
Yeah.
about why the thing lasts,
Yeah.
so
There's one emperor who does do that, and that's Justinian.
Mhm.